The Eastern Suburbs Railway. The first underground line opened since Town Hall in Wynyard in 1932, and infamously, a pain in the behind to build. So, why was it? How did the line come to be in the first place? And how come it doesn't go all the way to Bondi? Look, this is going to be another long one, like the Metro video, so you better buckle yourselves up. But before all that, I want to shout out my monthly Ko-fi supporters. Shareth, better known as Building Beautifully, Christopher, Samantha, and someone who just goes by Z. At no point did any of them stop me from making another video this long, therefore they should be held responsible. Now, in order to understand the context of the Eastern Suburbs line, we need to start in the 1850s. In 1855, the first line between Parramatta Junction, which today is known as Granville, and Sydney opened, with the Sydney terminus being just south of Devonshire Street in an area called Cleveland Paddocks, about where the end of Platform 1 at Central is today. Confusingly, this station was called Redfern, but it wasn't the same Redfern we know today. That station opened in 1884 and was called Everleigh. Not to be confused with the original Everleigh station that it replaced, which opened in 1878, which itself replaced another Everleigh station to the south, which opened in 1874. When the Central we know today opened, the original Redfern and Cleveland Paddocks closed, and the 1884 Everleigh station was renamed to Redfern. Now, I bring this up because if I don't address it now, this first section will be confusing. So, I'm going to refer to the pre-1906 Redfern as Redfern Terminus, and the current day Redfern as just Redfern or Everleigh. Now that's out of the way, while the Redfern Terminus would do for the time being, its location outside the city would prove to be rather bothersome, and would set forth Sydney's long-term desire for a railway into the city. The first attempt to fix this came under the leadership of John Whitton, who in 1857 put forward a proposal to build a new station to the east of Elizabeth Street between King and Park Streets, mostly on the present side of Hyde Park and St James Station today. Not only would this be close to the city, but it would also allow a future extension of Circular Quay for goods traffic. As you can probably guess, it didn't happen. The then governor vetoed the plan due to his preference towards horse-drawn vehicles over steam-powered locomotives. Alas, time marched on, but the desire for a city railway remained. The population was booming, and the need for a railway into the city was only becoming more relevant. Now, here's one thing I need to explain. Unlike the United States or United Kingdom, we never really had private railways in Australia. The first few lines would often be built by private companies, like the Sydney to Parramatta line, but will be taken over by the government not long after, which is what happened to that line in 1857. The result of this was you never had a period of railway mania, and all new railway construction would be handled by the government, and governments, just like today, are divided by priorities. In the case of Sydney, while the city railway was important, Parliament had to balance this with the needs of country areas. This was best exemplified when community groups proposed reviving the 1857 Whitton Plan, where the member for Paddington, John Sutherland, said in 1868, the interests of the city would be better served by extending railways further into the colony, and that the money required to extend the line in Sydney to St James Church would extend the line from Bathurst to Orange. So as you can guess, while the city railway was important, it was second priority to country lines, evidenced by the fact that the line reached Orange in 1877 but St James in 1926. However, even though the country took priority, it didn't stop people arguing for that new line into the city. In 1873, a community action group, consisting mostly of residents of the city, started putting forward proposals, most being a revival of the 1857 Whitton Plan, but there were some new ones. The most notable of which was a plan for a loop line beginning at the Redfern terminus and looping around the city via Darling Harbour, Circular Quay, Woolloomooloo, and then back to the Redfern terminus. Obviously, this was never pursued at all, but it's still an interesting example of a line that resembles the city circle we know today. Anyway, the calls for the city railway were joined by people in the eastern suburbs starting in 1876, and in that same year, a proposal was put forward to build a line from Redfern into the city for only £170,000, alongside an extension of the Illawarra line to Kiama for £740,000. Because of how long ago this was, I can't give you a solid estimate of how much this is adjusted for inflation, as the RBA calculator only goes back to 1901. But, adjusted for inflation from that date, we're looking at over $31 and $134 million respectively in 2023. While that doesn't sound like much today, remember, labour was cheap back then. If you want evidence that was a fair bit of cash, Parliament rejected construction of the Illawarra line due to cost, and because politically it'd be a bad look to cancel that but then build the city line, the Secretary for Public Works dropped the city railway as well. Unsurprisingly, the people who just spent multiple years advocating for a city railway were not happy and began to rally support, which they found, first in Randwick and Woollahra, as the people living there were beginning to be upset with their commute into Sydney on horse-drawn carriages or by walking. Second, they found in the country. Interestingly enough, with the MP of Orange condemning the lack of a railway into the city. This ultimately culminated in Whitten being asked by the government to update his 1857 plan for reconsideration, which he did. For the most part, this was the same as the prior plan, albeit now the terminus stations would be between King Street in the south, Hunter Street in the north, Castlereagh Street in the west, and Elizabeth Street in the east, just across from where Martin Place Station is today. He also dropped the extension to Circular Quay as he saw no need for a goods or passenger line to it, and he made provision for a line extending into the eastern suburbs, although he did not favour it. There was also an MP from St Leonards, which then encompassed most of North Sydney and the Northern Beaches, who proposed his own lines. The first starting at South Head and then heading down through Waverley and Woollahra before heading onto Newtown and out to Parramatta, while the other would start in Gladesville before heading through the North Shore, across the Spit and onto Manly. If you want an example of how things change, imagine an MP from the Northern Beaches proposing a rail line today. But while that was happening, at the same time, people in Randwick were bombarding the government with their own plans to get rid of those damn horse coaches, with one proposal suggesting a line branching off at Everley, then across to Waterloo, with a potential branch to Randwick Racecourse, and up to Waverley, floating back west through Woollahra, where it then reconnects to the line in Hyde Park. With all the pressure and plans, the government began to relent, and in 1879, the Metropolitan Railway Extension Bill was put forth. And while it does not specify any new routes, it would set out the standards for all new suburban lines. So, with the bills and the plans set forth, they're going to start building the lines right. No. Long story short, trams. They could provide the transport needs of the suburbanites, while also taking less time and money to build. This, combined with the large cost of the city railway resulting in it being canned, meant that if an eastern suburbs line was to be built, it would have nowhere to connect to. So, for the time being, money would continue to go to country lines. It also didn't help that the Metropolitan Railway Extension Bill got shot down too. Obviously, this isn't to say that all sport dried up completely. People still wanted that railway into the city and eastern suburbs, and the topic was frequently brought up in Parliament, only for it to be kicked down the road, as priority was given to other issues. However, by 1888, it could no longer be ignored. A petition for new suburban lines and a city railway was handed to Parliament with 64,000 signatures, which is especially impressive for a city of only 350,000 people. Just for population, that'd be the same as a petition today having 950,000 signatures. So you can clearly see that if 18% of a city wants something, you best get on it. 2 years go by, and they finally do, by conducting a royal commission to assess the proposals they've had thus far and determine which should be built. In 1891, it was handed to Parliament, and it recommended quite a few. So, this is the part of the video where I start focusing more on the east suburbs line. But before I do, I have to talk about one goof of a line. So as part of the Western Suburbs network, there would have been a branch off the main line between Petersham and Lewisham, which would then head north to Five Dock, which if you remember from my first video, Bradfield even proposed a similar line in his 1915 plan. But that's not what's notable about it. What is notable is the branch that heads west across Glebe and Ultimo before heading into the western side of the city and ending in a balloon loop. The Royal Commission doesn't really specify why, it's just weird, and surprisingly, they recommended it be built. Why? I don't know. Okay, so now to something resembling normalcy. For the most part, the lines examined were those I mentioned prior, that being the terminus north of Hyde Park with a short stub to Circular Quay, the loop via Randwick, and the line to South Head. But these are not the only lines. One branched off the Randwick loop at Waterloo and headed down to Botany, while two lines made their way down to La Perouse, with one western and one eastern line. Out of all these projects, the new city terminus, Randwick loop with Racecourse branch, and the eastern La Perouse lines were recommended for construction. Okay, so we have the plans, we have the political will, and we have a Royal Commission recommending new lines. and people are even offering parts of their land for free to build the Eastern Suburbs line. So surely they'll build something. Of course not. Long story short, the early 1890s were beset by a recession in Australia, which reduced capital spending by governments on public works projects. The 1890s also saw new trams using new technology, the first being a cable tram between Darling Harbour and Ocean Street in Woollahra, which opened in 1894, alongside a double-track electric tramway opening along George Street, Circular Quay in 1899. These would be joined by two additional lines along Pitt and Castlereagh Street in 1901. So, once again, the City and Eastern Suburbs Railway has been defeated by trams with a little help from a recession. As time went on, railway priorities eventually shifted towards upgrading the Redfern terminal, which was starting to feel the pressure with increased patronage. But when another Royal Commission in 1896 arose and recommended the Hyde Park terminus, it was shot down by locals who didn't want to see their precious park turned into railway yards, which, frankly, was valid. Curiously, this Royal Commission, apart from recommending the Hyde Park terminus and Eastern Suburbs line, also recommended a city loop with an additional line connecting to the North Shore across a new bridge, somewhat similar to the city circle we have today, but it doesn't matter, it was shot down anyway. Obviously, something still needed to be done about the capacity issue at the Redfern terminal, and Hyde Park was just not an option. So, the Railway Commissioners sought to build a new station north of Devonshire Street with a line to Circular Quay instead. In July 1900, this was approved, although the city circle from the Royal Commission was deferred for a future date. As you can probably guess, this station opened in 1906 and became known as Central. At the same time, Sydney was starting to have major issues with housing quality and affordability, combined with a plague outbreak and traffic congestion of goods coming into and out of the city. Thank God we've moved past that now. But, as a result, a Royal Commission to address these issues was instituted in 1908. And, for the most part, it's not relevant to this discussion. What is relevant is that it also supported building the Eastern Suburbs Railway and City Loop as put forth in the 1891 and 1896 Royal Commissions, albeit this time heavily supplemented with trams on the underground sections. Another interesting question raised in this commission was why the line didn't traverse closer to Bondi, Bronte and Coogee beaches, as at the time, surfing was becoming more popular, at which point the railways answered with, the current route serves more populated areas, which was true. There was some talk of having tramways connecting the beaches and Eastern Suburbs line, but railways are still preferred, and this was made redundant anyway when a tram line opened between the city and Bondi via Bellevue Hill in 1914. This, as you can probably guess, this Eastern Suburbs line proposal went nowhere. Kind of. In 1910, a new party would come to power in New South Wales, that being the Labor Party under Premier James McGowan, who previously was one of the commissioners on the 1908 to 1909 Royal Commission for the improvement of the City of Sydney and its suburbs, which, amongst other things, investigated the construction of the City Railway, Eastern Suburbs Railway, and a link across the harbour. For the City Circle, the recommendation was to branch off near Redfern, where it would enter a tunnel under Prince Alfred Park before continuing to a new underground station at Central, where it would then stop at Town Hall and Wynyard Square, where there would then be a junction to allow trains to head west under Darling Harbour and into Balmain. For trains following the City Circle, the next stop would be Circular Quay, which is followed by a wide junction to allow trains to proceed under the harbour via a tunnel that connects to the North Shore line at Milson's Point, while the other direction allows them to reach another Y, where one direction heads to St James, then Elizabeth Street before reaching Central again, while the other would carry onto the Eastern Suburbs with a station at the Domain, after which it would then follow the previous 1891 plan. While this is what the Royal Commission recommended, John Bradfield, who you may have heard of, suggested his own alterations to this proposal. His changes were to move Town Hall Station under George Street and to replace the Harbour Tunnel with a bridge that would start at Wynyard Square, before stopping at Kirribilli and North Sydney, before reconnecting to the main line near Waverton Station. The main reason for this was the draft of ships was increasing, so the tunnel would need to be made deeper to circumvent this, which would require a steeper approach. While the bridge also has this problem, it's not as dramatic. He also recommended changing the name of Elizabeth Street Station to Liverpool Street, as well as constructing a loop track to connect Liverpool Street and Town Hall Station. While this proposal was never put into practice, it would become the template for all later proposals, such as the report by David Hay of the English engineering firm Moulton Hay, which was delivered to the New South Wales Parliament on constructing the City, Railway and Eastern Suburbs line. The most notable feature was this was almost entirely meant to be underground. Okay, that's not notable, but the fact he wanted to use a tunnelling machine as opposed to blasting or cut and cover, as was typical for most subway systems around the world at the time. You may be thinking there was one subway system that did use tunnelling machines, and it also happened to be in the UK, that being the deep level tube of the London Underground. Interestingly, his proposal also included narrower tunnels with sharp curves, akin to the deep level tube, which would have been used by dedicated, narrower trains, which is an interesting fun fact. Anyway, he put forth the City Circle, with stations at Goulburn Street, Town Hall, Wynyard Square, Circular Quay, Post Office Mall Street, and Bathurst Street being served by mainline trains, while the Eastern Suburbs line would begin at Wynyard Square, porting south under York Street to Town Hall, where it then turned to follow Bathurst Street until Hyde Park, before reaching Liverpool Street Station, and then continuing under Oxford Street until Bondi Junction, stopping at Darlinghurst, Haddington, Woollahra, Centennial Park, and finally Bondi Junction. Surprisingly for a plan from 1912, it was fairly conservative, as even earlier plans envisaged the line continuing on. He also made provision for trams to use the line if rail electrification was not operational by the time it opened. In the end though, it was all for naught, as Hayes' scheme was rejected. For a few reasons. One was that the railway commissioners didn't want the East Suburbs Railway in a tunnel, and they preferred it to connect between St James and Circular Quay, as this would allow trains to loop around and return to whence they came. Also, they preferred the tunnels to be wide enough to operate mainline trains, as this would allow extra carriages to be put on during holiday periods. After it was rejected, in 1913, the railway commissioners pursued their own ideas for the Eastern Suburbs line. One route was begin at St James before turning eastwards under the Domain, while another would begin at Town Hall and head south-eastwards to the sporting grounds. However, John Bradfield, who was appointed the engineer in charge of the Sydney Harbour Bridge and City Transit Department of the Public Works Department in 1912, ended up working on its own proposal in January of 1913. This would be a loop based on Hayes' proposal, but in line with his earlier suggestion, Town Hall would be shifted west under George Street, and provision would be made to allow trams to use the tunnels pending railway electrification. Although the cost became an issue, totalling £4 million, including rolling stock, which goes to stir in Parliament, as the Minister for Public Works decided to spend as little as possible on the City Railway, while members for the Eastern Suburbs demanded it should be built. However, in December 1913, the Premier made a speech asserting the government was dedicated to the construction of the city and suburban railway system. In order to do so, it was important that the taxpayer got the best system available at the time. So to ensure that's the case, John Bradfield was tasked with travelling overseas to examine the best city and suburban railway practices around the world. On the 14th of March 1914, he departed and visited the United States, Britain, and Europe, although the latter journeys were restricted due to the outbreak of the First World War. On the 19th of September 1914, he returned and began work on arguably his magnum opus, Report on the Proposed Electric Railways for the City of Sydney, which was completed in August 1915, although only published in August 1916. So what did Bradfield put forward? Well, as I said many times before, I'm going to save the full details of his report for a separate video. But the Eastern Suburbs Railway, he built on his and the Railway Commissioner's 1913 proposal. So what did it look like? Well, we have the obvious city circle with stations at Town Hall, Wynyard Square, Circular Quay, St James, and Liverpool Street, with a loop back around to Town Hall. One interesting set of changes was the central platforms at Circular Quay Station. As mentioned prior, when discussing the 1909 Royal Commission, the Central City Circle platforms were to be underground at a 90-degree angle to the existing platforms. This was at the insistence of the Railway Commissioners, who wanted easier access for country passengers to the City Circle, and they wanted the eastern platforms marshalling at a goods yard, even though this plan would have cost more. However, Bradfield convinced them otherwise, as using the eastern platforms would provide a less steep grade and ultimately be cheaper. In the end, the eastern platforms were cleared for the City Railway, with their yard jobs being moved elsewhere. In a similar vein, Circular Quay was meant to be underground, but the steep grade required for it to be, as well as a redevelopment project in the rocks at the time, let the railway place it above ground. So that became part of the plan. Also, like the 1909 Royal Commission, he recommended a wide junction between Circular Quay and St James, which would then lead into the Eastern Suburbs line. However, in his 1914 preliminary plan, he recommended a stop at the Domain, followed by Darlinghurst, Glenmore Road, Paddington, Edgecliff, Bondi, Waverley, Little Coogee, Daceyville, Rosebery, and Waterloo, before reconnecting to the Illawarra line near Erskineville. However, The 1915 recommendation dropped the station at the Domain and Darlinghurst, with the final stop list being King's Cross, followed by Glenmore Road, then Paddington, Edgecliff, Bondi, Waverley, Little Coogee, Daceyville, Rosebery, Waterloo, and then once again reconnect to the Illawarra near Erskineville. In all of Bradfield's plans, the line would be partially above and underground, alongside some viaducts, such as at Woolloomooloo. On top of this, provision was made for future lines to be built at Vaucluse and La Perouse, as well as a route through Moore Park and Randwick Racecourse to service sports traffic. But that's not even the best part. You know what his proposal had that no other before it did? Legal authorisation, with the 1915 City and Suburban Electric Railways Act, which, amongst other things, authorised the East Suburbs line, albeit only as far as Bondi Junction. But still, it's authorised, so to be built. Right. What? Well, while the East Suburbs line is the focus of this video, as always, other priorities took hold, mainly railway electrification, the City Circle and the Harbour Bridge, because they were needed the most and the East Suburbs line relied on them being built. The other priority being, the First World War, for I assume obvious reasons. And as it dragged on, so did its effect on government finances. However, work began on the City Circle by 1916, but work was slow. And in 1918, it was decided to defer work on it as country lines, as always, took priority. However, when the war ended, suburban patronage began to grow, and with it growing, work could once again resume on the City Circle in 1922, albeit with some changes. The first of these were to be the wide junction for the East Suburbs line beneath the Domain, which was to go due to being difficult to construct. Instead, it would be replaced by the East Suburbs line following under Oxford Street, where it then connects to St James, where it then looped around under O'Connell Street before following Pitt Street south until Town Hall, where it would then use the lower level platforms. South of Town Hall, it would then follow George Street, where it then continue under Parramatta Road and follow the route of the proposed Western Suburbs line, which would connect to places like Annandale and Balmain. However, construction would not go as planned. The war brought improvements to the internal combustion engine, and cars, trucks and buses became more common. As such, city-siders who could afford to move out of the inner city, which is still somewhat slum-like, began moving west onto quarter-acre blocks, which, combined with increased car usage in the east, diminished the need for the line. That and allowed wealthy property developers to convince the government instead to invest in lines in the west, which eventually resulted in the Bankstown line being sent into Belmore and the East Hills line being built. There were other compounding factors, such as a decrease in working hours from 48 to 44 hours per week. Combined, the railways being required to pay 2/3 of the cost of the Harbour Bridge, the devaluation of the pound sterling, which made the bridge even more expensive, and the Great Depression beginning in 1929, all meant that funds had to be redirected elsewhere. As such, even as St James and Liverpool Street, now museum, opened in 1926, and Town Hall and Wynyard Square, now just Wynyard, opened alongside the Harbour Bridge in 1932, the eastern suburbs remained the domain of the trams, with the Lang government being dismissed in 1932 and then replaced with a United Australia and Country Party government who, I must note, have no affiliation with today's United Australia Party and are actually the predecessors to today's Liberal Party. This new government sought to cut spending and reduce the budget deficit. As such, spending on almost all transport projects were cut. Combined with the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939 and the Pacific in 1941, funds and manpower were cut further, even to the point where the final link in the City Circle, Circular Quay Station, was delayed until after the war. So now we reach the year of 1946. Victory has been achieved, so now it's time to rebuild, and Sydney was in an awkward spot. Prior to the war, immigration was at an all-time low, alongside birth rates. Between 1900 and 1915, the birth rate sat around 3.5 children per woman. However, this began to drop, hitting a low of 2.19 by 1935. Obviously, as you're already aware, this trend reversed after World War II in what we call the baby boom, with the fertility rate peaking at 3.55 children per woman in 1961. The same happened for migration, with Australia seeing a net loss of migrants between 1930 and 1939, to seeing a net gain of 150,000 in 1950 alone. So while that's interesting, why is it relevant to this? Well, during that time, the eastern suburbs of Sydney grew from 224,000 up to 282,000, which were only making up 4% of the total growth of Sydney at the time. As most of it went to the outer suburbs, Sydney's east, as a whole, grew by a whopping 26%. Just for comparison, the lowest percentage growth of those areas was Botany, at 14.5% growth. Today, no suburb in eastern Sydney is predicted to grow more than 0.5% in the next 20 years. In fact, if you're curious, the same population data for today shows Sydney's east as only having 320,000 people, or 40,000 more than in 1947. And people say Sydney's east is full. In large part, the densification of the east came primarily due to a building boom that began in the 30s and picked up post-war, with 60% of all housing stock in Woollahra being flats or tenements, and the amount of apartments in Sydney doubling from 1933 to 1947. But why there? Well, one of the biggest reasons was proximity to the city and the beach, which is of great importance in a car-free world. That, and most housing stock in the east had a sewer line connection, unlike the west. As such, this boom made the east the densest part of Sydney, and considering that in 1948, public transport made up 89% of all journeys and 92% in peak, the area was starting to struggle, only being served by buses and trams. So, even though there was still a lot of maintenance and work to be done elsewhere, the Eastern Suburbs line was pushed up the priority list. Eventually, we got the 1947 City and Suburban Electric Railways Amendment Act, which set forth the railway we know today. It made provisions for 4 lines: the Eastern, First Southeastern, Second Southeastern, and Southern Suburbs lines, with potential extensions to each. First up, the East Suburbs line, beginning at an underground platform at Central underneath Chalmers Street, before proceeding into a tunnel under the existing city circle and Belmore Park to the lower level platforms of Town Hall, before turning east to a new station at Martin Place, then heads under Macquarie Street and the Domain, before heading overground on a viaduct to the underground King's Cross station. Following that, it continues east, stopping at Rushcutters Bay, Double Bay, Edgecliff, and Bondi Junction. Then followed on by Bellevue Hill, Bondi Road, Tamarama, and Bondi Beach. The proposed extension would have taken it north from Bondi Beach to North Bondi and Dover Road, then looping back and connecting to the existing line at Double Bay, forming a loop. Of course, while I'm here, I've got to discuss the other 3 lines. The first is the First Southeastern Suburbs line. Branching off the city circle between St James and Museum, it would then head east under Oxford Street, with the first stop being Wentworth Avenue, after which it would continue to a station at Taylor Square, and then turning south towards a stop at the Cricket Ground and Randwick Racecourse, before continuing south to Kingsford, terminating at a station around where today's Juniors Kingsford Light Rail stop is. The line's extension would have seen it travel south from Kingsford to Matraville, then east and north under the Rifle Range to Maroubra Bay, before continuing north and reconnecting to the existing First Southeastern line near Cowper Street. And before the Showground Station, the second Southeastern Suburbs line began at Taylor Square and continued under Oxford Street towards Bondi Junction, stopping at Paddington, Woollahra, and Nelson Street. From Bondi Junction, it would have continued south, stopping at Waverley, Bronte, Clovelly, and Coogee. If extended, it would have continued south from Coogee to Maroubra Bay and reconnect the first Southeastern Suburbs line, kind of forming a loop. The final line was the Southern Suburbs line, beginning at Swamp Road with junctions to the existing Bankstown and East Hills lines, before following the Botany Goods line as far as Kingsford Smith Aerodrome, before heading north to stations at Shays Creek and Gardeners Road, and then following Botany Road, stopping at Beaconsfield and Alexandria, before reaching an underground station at Redfern, and if extended, it would see a branch extended south from Gardeners Road Station towards Mascot, following the goods line as far as Banksia Street, and connecting to the Southeastern Suburbs line at Matraville, of course, forming a loop. Now, I don't know what it was with people in 1946, but the amount of loops planned seems rather strange. There's probably a document in the State Archives somewhere about how they plan to run these services, but I'm yet to find it. Because it would have been a pain to run these with how many options there are. You could have run an East Hills to Penrith service via Central, Coogee, Kingsford, Central again, Alexandria, and Bankstown. So I want to know what they were cooking. Alongside this, provision was also made for an additional 2 tracks between Sydenham and the city on the Illawarra line, which began construction not long after. However, it was abandoned in 1949. But, moving on, as you can probably guess, nothing got started on this project. Like before, we had all the plans and all the political will, but nothing happened. This time it was nothing. They actually started building it. The first line to be constructed was, of course, the East Suburbs line, with an estimated cost of £9.45 million, or $762 million in today's money. However, while it was authorised and work began, In the 1946-1947 financial year, only £187,000 were allocated, or $15 million today, which you can probably guess wasn't enough to build the line, so work was slow. At a parliament debate in 1950, the opposition leader, Vernon Triat of the newly created Liberal Party, calculated that at the rate of progress of construction in 1949, the line would be complete between the years of 2119 and 2170, about the same time the first Fallout game takes place. But don't worry, if the funds currently allocated were doubled, it could be pushed forward to as early as 2035. 11 years in the future from me making this video. And on top of that, there were other issues. The post-war boom brought new workers, but they went into building homes and other projects. And the cement Eastern Suburbs line needed, also needed for new homes. However, work would continue, just slowly, at least until 1950, when a series of coal strikes and the Korean War crushed railway revenues and reduced available manpower further. This, combined with Australia being at near full employment and the US buying a crapload of wool for strategic supplies in case the Korean War escalated, in turn resulting in a massive spike in the demand for wool, led to widespread inflation in Australia. This in turn resulted in the government cutting spending massively in 1952 and 1953, thereby stopping all work on the East Suburbs line. But the worst was yet to come. Urban sprawl kicked in and public transport usage dropped. In 1945, they saw a peak of 500 million passenger journeys, which dropped to only 375 million journeys in 1952. This, combined with the Department of Road and Tram Transport seeking to replace its fleet of 1,000 trams with 1,600 buses taking priority, further dried up funding. So, the lack of funding, manpower, and resources making it impossible, and declining public transport usage, reducing demand, the need for the ESR was gone. Not to say it was dead, limited work would continue, but it wasn't until the 1960s it would kick off again. In 1961, the debate was raging on whether or not investing in railways was even a viable option anymore, and if we should shift to building freeways instead. As such, the government commissioned the firm Deleu, Casa and Company to examine the most viable option for transport in Sydney's east. They examined 3 options: rail rapid transit, bus operations on expressways and surface roads, and joint construction of expressways and railways. When the report was handed to Parliament in 1963, it investigated a few rail routes in brief detail, all of which tried to maximise the use of assets that had already been started on. The report recommended that in an ideal situation, an expressway with median running rail would be the best option, similar to recently constructed lines in Chicago. However, doing so is likely to be expensive, and that transport options were needed now, and waiting for an expressway to be financed and built would take longer than just building the rail line. As such, the recommendation was for an independent construction of a rail system. Interestingly, the report recommended that fully motorised trains be ordered, as opposed to the 50-50 split of motor and trailer cars that Sydney uses today. They also recommended rolling stock with 3 wide doors per side of the train. If you're thinking, that sounds like a metro, you'd be right. The headways are expected to be 6 minutes with existing trains and 5 minutes with new trains during peak, and 15 for both off-peak. And now, if you're wondering why I never mentioned that in my Sydney Metro video, well, I only found out about this document 2 days after posting it. So, the other interesting part of the report was that the area's bus network should be fully integrated with the rail line, akin to what had been done with Toronto's Line 1 that opened in 1954, which had stations with integrated bus-rail interchanges. Doing so, the report argued, would not only boost patronage, but also public transport access in the areas not even served directly by the rail line, which, going off how successful that made Toronto's Line 1, makes it a solid idea. But enough about that. What route did they propose? Well, they examined a few. First, Route A would start at King's Cross, head westerly through Martin Place and Town Hall, then to the new underground Central Chalmers Street platforms, voiding easterly through Bondi Junction and terminating at Coogee. Route B would begin at Central, through to Town Hall and Martin Place, then King's Cross, Rushcutters Bay, Edgecliff, Woollahra and Bondi Junction, with a potential extension to Bondi Beach in the future. Route C was a bit odd because it would begin at St James, reusing the original East Suburbs line platforms there, and Central Chalmers Street, for rejoining to become a single line and then continuing under Oxford Street, stopping at Taylor Square and Bondi Junction. Route D was the same as C, but after Taylor Square, it would head south to the Sports Ground, Showground, Centennial Park, and the University of New South Wales. Route E was more conventional, beginning at Bondi Junction and following the same route as Route B, but after Town Hall, stopping at a new station just north of Central, not reusing the partially constructed Chalmers Street platforms, and from there, it would follow Route D until the racecourse, where it would travel down the east side and stop at UNSW and Kingsford. The final route was F, which would begin at Central Chalmers Street, pointing through Town Hall and Martin Place, and then following Route B until Woollahra, where it would continue south with stations at Oxford Street, Queen's Park, Randwick, UNSW, and terminating at Kingsford. In the end, they recommended Route F on the grounds that it would use the most pre-existing construction, had more of the land surveyed for construction, and it would be the easiest to construct bus route interchanges on. It would also be feasible to break it into two stages, the first being central to Oxford Street, and the second from Oxford Street to Kingsford, while also providing the most coverage of all the proposed routes, thereby having the most potential patronage. Unfortunately, the government mostly sat on it, but it did spur political interest, especially as there was an election in 1965. But before we move on to that, I want to interject. So, I thought I was done editing this video, and I sat down to work on OpenTDD stuff. And as part of that, I was reading John Dunn's History of Commonwealth Engineering, Volume 2, where he mentions something called ComERT. So, ComERT, or ComEng Electric Rapid Transit System, was an idea for a low-floor metro system for Sydney's northern beaches. Designed by ComEng engineer Ian McFarlane in the mid-1960s. McFarlane, by the way, keep that name in mind because he'll come up in future videos. Uniquely, the trains were effectively half of a double-decker, with the passengers in a low-slung gondola between Jacobs bogies, with passengers seated in dog box style compartments with a door each. Also, it was third rail powered. So why am I bringing it up here? Because Alex Stoney, another ComEng engineer, proposed dividing the ESR tunnels in half and running ComERT trains above and below each other like this. The government showed no interest in it, but it's still an interesting idea. Also, if you're wondering why I'm only using OpenTDD sprites to show what these trains would look like, it's because I didn't plan on talking about ComERT for a while, so I never got the rights to use any of the images. But now I've said my piece, now we get to talk about the 1965 election. An election that Labor, who had been in power since 1941, lost, and a new Liberal government under Sir Robert Askin won. And most notably, of the 9 Labor seats that changed hands, 2 of them were in the eastern suburbs, those being Blight, covering Paddington and Waverley, and Coogee, which covers Coogee and Bondi. So just like the Metro video, politics is back. As you can probably guess, the Liberals wanted to keep the east on side. So, prior to the election, they promised to build the line. And now they're in government, they have to make it happen. Because losing either of these 2 seats would potentially lose them the next election. The government would make no word of their plans until 1966, where they announced the project would resume, although as an independent line not connected to the existing system. Well, that's not true. There would be a connection between Central and Erskineville on the Illawarra line, although it would only be single track, but with provision of duplication in the future. As originally planned, this new line would follow Route F as recommended in the 1963 report, but instead of heading south up to Woollahra, it would head east to Bondi Junction, primarily due to the growth of the shopping centre in that area, before heading south to Charing Cross, Frenchman's Road, Randwick, UNSW, and terminating at Kingsford, with bus rail interchanges at Edgecliff, Bondi Junction, Randwick, and Kingsford. The planned opening of the line would be to Edgecliff by 1973, Bondi Junction by 1974, and Kingsford by 1977, and the line was to be served by double-deck trains equipped with power-operated doors, which was also fairly novel, because remember, this is 1966. Fully double-deck electro-multiple units are yet to exist. The first wouldn't be built until Tulloch delivered their prototype motor cars in 1968. Obviously, if you want to see a video on them, you should subscribe, because that video is on my to-do list. In the end, the railways eventually got their say, and they added a second tunnel for the Central to Erskineville section, and added platforms at Redfern, thus allowing through services from the Illawarra line. But this would be built later. In 1967, construction resumed. By 1968, tenders for tunnelling were called for and allocated. In 1970, the Woolloomooloo Viaduct began construction, and for the most part, construction would continue smoothly. There were some weird events, like a cave-in at Redfern destroying an electrical goods store, and the blasting around King's Cross causing a rat plague in the surrounding area, as well as a mass at a tunnel entrance to mark St. Barbara's Day, the patron saint for explosives, for some reason. However, as is normal with the ESR, this wouldn't last forever, and by 1972, the cost was beginning to balloon. The cost of remediating the 1950s era works for modern use were underquoted, being more expensive than planned. Combined with the order for rolling stock being more than expected, led the government investigating continuing work with the project. There was some hope. In 1972, Labor won the federal election, and part of their promise was to commit $97 million to complete the line. But the Whitlam government did have other issues to deal with, to say the least. There was also the issue with still declining public transport usage, straining railway revenues further. As a consequence, urban rail, bus and ferry services were merged together under the Public Transport Commission in 1972, which then took over the project. They eventually estimated the cost would be over $200 million. As a consequence, terminating the line at Bondi Junction was considered. Eventually, the opening schedule was changed to Edgecliff in late 1974, Bondi Junction in 1975, and Kingsford by 1977 or 1978. As you can probably guess, shit eventually did hit the fan, and the 1973 oil crisis saw inflation once again boom, hitting a whopping 15% in 1974, which dramatically ballooned the cost of the project, which was still a long way from completion. Work was still yet to begin past Bondi Junction after all, and it was looking like it would be delayed further. Work continued as normal though, with the tracks at Erskineville being connected to the single track tunnel in June 1974, thereby allowing two 73 class locomotives, numbers 7342 and 7343, to be modified to work overhead wiring and rail trains. As time went on, work continued, but the future of the line would be determined by who won the upcoming 1976 election. Labor had no official stance, while the Liberal policy was to prioritise other parts of the network before the ESR, which would delay the ESR further. As you're probably aware, Labor won, and Neville Wran became Premier, someone who was quite influential on the development of railways in New South Wales in the latter part of the 20th century. But that's for a future video. Not long after winning the election on the 29th of June 1976, they announced a board of review to inquire into the project. Their goal was to see if the project should be abandoned, or if it were to be continued, in what form. There were even some suggestions that tram-like light rail vehicles be used that would leave the tunnels at Edgecliff and Bondi Junction and run on the streets. Obviously, this didn't go anywhere, in large part due to wiring, signals and rails for heavy rail vehicles already being installed from Erskineville to Martin Place. The board eventually came back, stating that the line south of Bondi Junction be abandoned, alongside Woolloomooloo Station, to cut costs. The latter part came with great delight to the NIMBYs there who weren't too happy with the station being built near them. They also cut various works at Redfern, Central, Martin Place and Bondi Junction to further reduce costs. In the end, this brought the total cost down from the previous estimates of $250 million to Kingsford to only $165 million to Bondi Junction, with an estimated opening of 1980 to 1981. As you'd expect, work continued, with the first passenger train being a group of engineers travelling between Martin Place and Edgecliff in open wagons in 1976. By 1977, the first electric cars traversed the line, those being C3954 and D4050, hauled behind 7343, in a test to check for any clearance issues. The first 4-car train would be set S29, hauled behind 7343, which made it all the way to Bondi Junction on 21st of May 1978. This would be followed by a 2-car special hauled on the 18th of July, once again hauled by 7343. There was also one more strange guest that rode the line. 134S, built by Ritchie Brothers in 1899 as a D-class tram, which was converted into a scrubber car in 1930. If you don't know, it's what it says on the tin. It uses carborundum blocks to scrub the rails and clean them. In 1978 and 1979, it was used to clean the rails to prepare them for opening, and it gave us some first photos of a tram working on the ESR. If you're curious, it was preserved, and today you can find it at the Sydney Tramway Museum. But, moving on, by the 23rd of October 1978, the overhead line was energised for the first time, and by December 1st, it was declared ready for service. And on the same day, the first electric train left Flemington at 8:52 a.m. and entered the new line at 9:40 a.m. to begin testing, a job it would do till 2:30 p.m. that day. But of course, with all things regarding the East Suburbs line, things would not go smoothly forever. By mid-1978, it was appearing that it would open by 1979, a year earlier than expected. However, they didn't have enough trains. The expected number would be 106 double-deck carriages with 10 spares to run a shuttle service between Central and Kingsford. But with the line being cut back, this would drop to 32 cars, including 4 spares for the same shuttle. To get the original number of cars, in 1971, they issued a tender for 54 motor cars, 10 driving trailers, and 42 plane trailers for 106 cars in total, with an expected delivery date of around 1974 to coincide with the opening of the ESR. In July 1972, out of the 2 tenderers, Tulloch and Comenge, the latter won the contract, with deliveries beginning in November 1973. Obviously, I'll go into more detail when I do the S-set video. So while, new trains were being delivered, these went into general service on other lines before the ESR opened. Problem being, now that the line was delayed, those cars were needed elsewhere, as earlier Bradfield trains needed to go. So, new trains would need to come in, but due to industrial action, the PTC was short 50 motor cars, leading to cutbacks in the normal timetable, resulting in 7-car trains across the network. Things would ease with newer Comenge and now Gunnenan S-set cars being delivered. However, a shortage of rolling stock would only be one problem, the latter being industrial disputes leading to the signalling system not being fully commissioned by the end of 1978. These 2 factors led to the planned opening fluctuating wildly from late 1978 to 1979 to 1981. There were some indications that it would open in January 1979, but this never happened. Eventually, driver training would begin on the 5th of March 1979, and on the 24th of April, it was announced the line between Central and Bondi Junction would open on the 23rd of June 1979. As the day drew closer, Neville Rand chose to follow in the footsteps of his Labor predecessors, namely Jack Lang, who opened the Harbour Bridge in 1932, and Joseph Carhill, who opened Circular Quay Station in 1956, and chose to lead the opening ceremony himself. On the day, at 10:30 a.m, the first train left Martin Place Station, consisting of 8 stainless steel double-deck cars led by set S54, which, oddly enough, was a Gunnenan S-set, not a Comenge one, as originally envisaged. Alas, the train arrived at Bondi Junction successfully, carrying Rand and his party of politicians, and at 12:30 p.m. that same day, the public would be allowed to ride on the line for the first time. Within the first day and a half, 250,000 people would do so, and by the 25th of June, the first fares were paid and it proved a massive success. And just ignoring the transport benefits for the eastern suburbs, just look at the architecture. Most of the stations were constructed in a modernist style, and they're beautiful. Martin Place looks like something out of a sci-fi, and most of the stations still look impressive even today. I wasn't alive in 1979, if you couldn't tell by looking at me, but I can't imagine how they must have appeared to people back then. The line also had these beautiful neon signs at Martin Place, and automatic magnetic ticketing, which for the time was pretty advanced.
Hey, so editing Zach here. I want to take just a few minutes to look at the stations on the line because they're absolutely stunning, and I genuinely cannot understate how impressive for the time they looked. And I want to make one thing clear. I've left links in the description below because there are so many beautiful photos that I just can't show in the video. Also want to highlight one thing, which is the neon sign above the ticket booths at Martin Place Station. I find this absolutely marvelous. It's a beautiful sign. But unfortunately, the bad news is, obviously it's not there anymore. Good news is, I did ask around and seemingly it is in the possession of Sydney Trains, and apparently they are considering putting it back, which, God, please do. It is a beautiful sign. Also, to give me a little bit more time to show off these photos, I do want to mention 2 things. One, the film they used for taking the photos for the progress shots for the Eastern Suburbs line is absolutely fascinating. I need to get my hands on it. The film has this sort of green grain to it, which I really like, because it reminds me a lot of Ace Combat and the Matrix films. And the other thing is, whoever entered a lot of the photos into the state archives clearly had fat thumbs, which, understandable, I'm the same, because a lot of the photos are incorrectly dated. For example, those photos I showed earlier of the scrubber tram are dated 1907, which obviously not the case. And there's quite a few photos of places like King's Cross that are dated that way. So if you do go into the archives yourself, just, be aware of that.
But enough of me gushing about it. Up to here, I've based a lot of my script on the work of Ian A. Brady, who wrote a series of articles in the Australian Railway Historical Society's Bulletin in 1979 on the history of the Eastern Suburbs line. Don't worry, I've not done a James Somerton, and I've not just read you his article. Where possible, I've fact-checked everything. If you want evidence of that, the goofy loop line from the 1891 Royal Commission isn't mentioned in his article. So take that as evidence that doing your own research is bloody worth it. But anyway, obviously, writing in 1979, he could only chronicle the line up till then. And he says in his conclusion, only time will show whether the enthusiasm of the first weekend will give this long-wanted railway the success it achieved at that time. So, was it a success? Well, as opened, the line was a shuttle between Central and Bondi Junction. But on the 20th of July 1980, the platforms at Redfern would open and the line would be formally integrated into the Illawarra line. All the line's single-deckers had since been replaced by double-deckers, making the Illawarra and Eastern Suburbs line the exclusive domain of the double-deckers. In regards to how well used the ESR is nowadays, nearly 55 years later, well, I can't get specific ESR data for just Redfern, Central and Town Hall. But Martin Place is the 12th most used station in Sydney, with King's Cross being 14th, Edgecliff being 3rd, and Bondi Junction being 6th. So, I'd call that a success. So, now it's open. What next? Well, obviously I'm going to talk about the Bondi Beach extension. But before that, I want to take a detour. In 1984, Martin Place Station was a location used in the film One Night Stand, which is a somewhat unheard of Australian film. The film's premise is pretty basic. 4 young people are in the opera house during a nuclear conflict, and as best what I can describe as a pre-apocalyptic setting. The world is ending, and as the characters come to terms with it. The only film with a similar feel, in my opinion, would be the original Mad Max. But obviously, this one's not an action movie. So I say if you want, give it a go. You might have to check your local second-hand shop, or the VHS rip some old mate posted to YouTube, because unfortunately, it's not really on any streaming services. Not to spoil it, but Martin Place is only really at the end of the film, but the film contains some really good shots of what it looked like in 1984, and it has music from Midnight Oil, which is an automatic win in my book. So, moving on. As I mentioned before, the next question was where to take it from here. Obviously, the original plan was extended to Kingsford, but with it being diverted to Bondi Junction, that's not easy to do. The next logical extension was towards Bondi Beach, and the justification would come in the 90s, with car becoming premier and the Olympics on the horizon. They set forth their plan called Action for Transport 2010. Apart from the Bondi Beach link, there were plans for other lines, such as the Parramatta Rail link and the airport line, which you can learn more about in my Metro video. Back on topic, so while the car government did want the line, they didn't want to pay for it. So, it would have to be constructed by a public-private partnership. So, a tender was put out, and the Bondi Beach Railway Company, a consortium of land developer Lendlease and Macquarie Bank, won. As originally planned, the project would cost $150 million and carry a single line under Waverley Park between Bondi Road and Burrell Street, with a 2-platform station being constructed under the southern portion of Bondi Beach, with an entrance on Queen Elizabeth Drive. The choice to have a single track was a bit odd, as it would limit capacity, but the 2-platform station would allow a train to load and unload while another train was arriving or departing. So it wasn't too bad, but the government wasn't keen and foresaw the layout causing bottlenecks. As such, they committed $94 million to add a second running tunnel. So much for not paying for it, I guess. With the project being a public-private partnership, there was also the issue of the Bondi Beach Railway Company making money. The plan was, after 30 years, they'd hand it over to the government, which was good. But during that time, they charge a $2.50 fee on top of every fare for people using the station, similar to the airport line surcharge, which was built at the same time and also by a private company. But anyway, Construction was set to begin in 1999, with the line opening in 2002, and the project looked promising. Both the government and opposition supported it. It seemed to cost a reasonable amount and was expected to take 1.62 million cars off the roads of Bondi annually, while increasing the amount of people travelling to Bondi by 4.5%. However, that never happened. So, why? NIMBYs, because of course it was. The group Save Bondi Beach Incorporated was founded, who opposed the line. And why? I'll give them props. They're one of the most honest NIMBY groups I've seen. They wanted to stop the line because, if built,
there will be a likely increase in social problems in this area.
And that the line would open up the area to new high-rise development. Yeah, you can probably see the dog whistles there. By increase in social problems, we know they're referring to poor and non-white people having access to the area too. They're just rich pricks who hate poor people. Best exemplified by one guy saying,
I actually want to have Bondi quarantined from the rest of Sydney. The visitors aren't paying rates, locals like me are. Get them out of here.
Ignoring that people visiting Bondi provide revenue by purchasing goods at local businesses, and also the high-rise point would be valid if there was upzoning surrounding the project, but there wasn't. That was just speculation on their part. And some of the arguments that Save Bondi Beach made were also just ridiculous. One was,
the railway will spoil public space by being ugly.
Which would be fair if it weren't underground. Also, the only above ground part of the line would have been the station at Bondi Beach, which would be tiny. There was also the argument that
tunneling under Bondi Beach will ruin the heritage of the beach.
Because apparently the ground underneath is now heritage. So the arguments basically boiled down to not wanting poor or non-local people, and they came up with conspiracies and wild theories to justify that. And these people were rabid. Allegedly, they even sabotaged a truck doing survey work for the line in 1997, spilling diesel into the ocean in the process. And the worst part is, Michael Caton, who played Daryl Kerrigan in the film The Castle, was a large part of the fight to shut it down, attending many protests. Which is just disappointing that around the same time The Castle came out, a film celebrating the ability for working class people to fight and win, he would go and join a protest with the explicit goal of shutting poor people out from accessing a beach. Although, maybe that's just me being too cynical. In the end, it didn't matter anyway. While they did delay the project, the death knell would come in 2000, with the airport link, built under similar economic rationale, not performing as planned, with the parent company going into liquidation in 2001. As such, the government didn't want to risk the Bondi Beach link seeing the same fate and stopped work on the line. Is it likely to happen in the future though? Well, the buses there are still chockers, but the mayor in 2018, John Wakefield, while acknowledging the buses are full,
don't want Bondi to become like the Gold Coast. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it.
So it seems the NIMBY attitude is still there. Waverley Council did put forth a light rail proposal, but that also went nowhere and is out of the scope of this video anyway. So, what about the existing line? Have there been any proposals for an extension since? And are they likely to happen? The answer is unfortunately a resounding no. The current state level transport strategy makes no plans for an extension, and knowing what the eastern suburbs can be like, frankly, even if they plan one, they'd probably shut it down. So, that's a bit of a somber ending if I'm honest. The line that overcame so much to get built is now seemingly left without consideration for its future. The only thing that's currently planned for it is the rollout of the European Train Control System Level 2 signalling, which began in 2018 and will replace the current trackside signalling with cab signalling, which in turn will allow more trains to be run on the ESR once complete in the coming years, which is important, don't get me wrong, but it's a bit boring. So with that, I'm not actually sure how to end this video now. I guess to conclude, the ESR is a testament just to how much political will and sheer luck you need to get a project off the ground. Frankly, it should have been open 100 years ago. But we don't live in that timeline, unfortunately. So I guess if you like this video, you can give it a like. And if you want to see more, you should subscribe too. I do these deep dives every so often. If you hate me and want to encourage my bad habits, you can join my Ko-fi. If you support me monthly, you get a shout out, like on the side of the video, and it allows me to invest more in my videos and spend too long working on videos like this. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one, which hopefully will be shorter and out sooner. Also, if you're curious, yes, I did go out of my way to ensure this video went up on the anniversary of the line opening. And now, the bloopers. There were some weird events, like a... Why are there so many trucks? Oh yeah, they've been digging out Hunter Street, right? And the blasting around King's Cross, causing a rat plague in the surrounding area. Yeah, because they set off the dynamite to blast the tunnel, and all the rats would see that go, shit, and scatter. So just the streets of King's Cross would be full of rats. And Kingsford by 1977 or 1978. Done. Actually, don't stop yet. I just want to get this on fucking record because I get to Central to change the ESR. There's a medical incident there, so that's shut down. That's completely thrown our filming off today. Get to Parliament House to film this final segment. There's a protest for koalas and like logging. You know, good on them. But on the other side, you can't see them because they're behind a taxi. But there's a bunch of people protesting like the equality bill. It's like, I got no fucking idea what's happening over there. Shut up. All right, stop the recording now. I want to try them all because I need to pace myself more.
It gets very rough.
Yeah, I just speak fast normally.
Maybe after every sentence, like pause, take a breath or something. Like not a real breath, but just take an in your head breath.
Something like, the Eastern Suburbs Railway. The first underground line to open since Town Hall and Wynyard opened in 1932.
Imagine that noise, live in your head, and then get it.
No, I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
I think that's funny.
Just do that.
Hello, Mr. Bird. Also for context, the reason that's there is because that's all full of asbestos. Everything around here is full of asbestos. The options were either film nowhere near Central or in the park full of asbestos. There was a pigeon there that had broken a leg. There's an ibis there. Yeah.
That tree touches you.
Yes. That's fine.
Dangerous dog.
I don't want to be touched by trees. I hate trees.
Like that stick was
Good. It's gone. No more stick.
okay.
Actually, one thing that Chris Topher included in his recent video that we did, we had a shot where I was facing the military barracks, and while he was doing his thing, I think he cut it, but you could see like a soldier approaching the background because he came up and asked, like, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" It's like, make sure, you know, he was chill. He was basically like, you know, hey, just don't zoom into the windows or anything. You know, keep it broad for obvious reasons. But it's funny as well because I think he probably recorded it. But this, like before he did that shot, I was already talking about, hey, you know, have you heard of I think it's the Defense Act 1935, where it's like, if you're caught filming a military installation, they can seize everything you have on you to record or take information. So pens, pencils, cameras, etc. Like they're that strict. And any soldier can walk up and be like, give me that, I'm seizing it. And it's like, then we have a soldier approaching us. I'm disappointed he didn't include it in the bloopers, but he doesn't really do bloopers, so I would have. This isn't to say all sport dried up completely. They should pedestrianise this, like sincerely. With the amount of protests that happen here, like why not? At the same time, Sydney was starting to have major issues with housing quality and affordability, combined with a plague outbreak and traffic congestion of goods coming into and out of the city. Thank God we've moved past that now. But I can't say that one. Asbestos in the background. You know, literally, so this is like 1890s. I think housing is as unaffordable now as it was back then. That was the last time it was this unaffordable, which is just... Another interesting question raised in the commission was why the line didn't traverse closer to Bondi, Bronte, and Coogee Beach. I can't pronounce that. Another interesting question raised in this commission was why the line didn't traverse closer to Bondi, Bronte, and Coogee beaches. As it, no, it's Coogee. I don't know. I'm not from the eastern suburbs.
Spelled Coogee, but I think it's one of those
I-
tricky ones you get the week for.
I don't care. It's Coogee to me.
Coogee.
Um,
I think it's Coogee.
I'll punch you if it's not.
I think it's Coogee.
I've heard Sheriff mention in a video. He said a Coogee.
Let's look it up.
No,
Quickly.
I'm not looking up.
5 seconds.
I'm not looking up.
Alright.
Where?
This is the quality people pay for.
Yeah. The quality research is the writing, not other parts.
You're